Alrighty. Well, welcome, Kings, to the Sportfolio Trading Desk, where we're going to help you make sharper, more informed bets, giving you an insider's view of how we are leveraging the Sportfolio Kings tools to see the market, allocate capital, extract alpha. So I'm Brett.
And I'm Zach.
And we're the founders of Sportfolio Kings and the lead strategists for the platform's managed sportfolios. So let's hit the opening bell and get to work.
All right, let's get it going. Bada bing, bada boom. Who do we have on deck today? We have the Chicago Bears. Talk to us, Brett, about what we're saying with the 2020 look back.
Yeah, well, so, we're in preseason mode, still forming our initial macro theses, building out, back testing some new models to help us spot exploitable inefficiencies in the market. And we're going to be sharing all of these preliminary insights with you for all 32 teams, not just the Bears, over the course of the summer and as we head into week one in early September. So the breakdown is going to include a look back at each team's 2020 performance, the storylines that defined that team's narrative, how that narrative may or may not have changed over the offseason. And then we'll pivot into previewing the team's 2021 schedule and evaluate just the broader market expectations and whether or not we spot any actionable opportunities to bet on. So as Zach mentioned today, we're going to be previewing the Chicago Bears. Is Andy Dalton washed? Is Justin Fields the future? Can the Bears actually manufacture points this year? A lot of questions. So the Bears closed 2020 going 8-8 straight up, 8-8 against the spread, somehow made the playoffs, and then got decisively trounced by the Saints. Looking at average margin of victory, average cover, we can see those are 0.1 and 2.3 points, respectively. So, really the definition of an average team. But we can also see they played the 29th ranked schedule. So despite that easy road, simply not talented enough to really take advantage. So looking at the graphic to the left, we can see how the Bears performed versus market expectations over the course of the 2020 season. And that's using the super contest data as a proxy. So a lot of information to communicate here. So just let me quickly explain. So the size of the bars indicate the amount of support from bettors. The color indicates whether or not the Bears covered the spread. Orange being that they did cover, navy, they didn't cover. The dots give us information on what the Vegas spread was, being the gray dot, and then by how much the Bears either successfully covered by or did not cover by. So this could be really helpful information just as to patterns in how teams perform, relative to market expectations. So in the Bears chart here, what I find fascinating is that pretty much any time the market started to buy into the Bears, they then disappointed. So anytime the Bears had considerable market support, using kind of say 15% as a threshold, the Bears covered and rewarded those bettors. And then the Bears proceeded to fail to cover the next week. So week one, we can see here, over 15% in support, cash, cha-ching, and then a week two loss. Week six, over 15%, rewarded bettors, cashed. Week seven, loss. Week eight, over 15%, rewarded bettors, cash. Week nine, loss. Week 16, over 15% support, rewarded bettors, cash. Week 17, loss. So, this is just the kind of market-oriented observations, we don't really see being compiled or discussed a lot in the industry, but we think, this is the type of information that is really critical to a handicapper's, broader tool chest. Too many bettors are focused exclusively on stats, and stats are important. We're gonna talk about some stats, but they don't talk about or just flat out ignore the market-oriented results, the patterns, how the market adjusts, its expectations for teams over time, how you can spot trends and when teams may be over or undervalued. So, this is just one example of this kind of stuff that we're going to be bringing to the industry, bringing to market more and more. And again, something that you don't see any of our leading competitors really offering. So whether that's Action Network or VSiN or PFF, none of them are doing anything like this. And we think it's just so important, to look at this type of stuff, if you really want to get an edge in kind of betting on the broader macro themes of these teams.
Yeah, and to speak on that, it's something I've started to do. I've been doing, obviously, since been betting for many years now. But as far as last year goes, like with the Bears, is you could see the market narrative on the Bears in advance leading up to, let's say, week 14 versus the Texans, right? So if we look at the chart, this kind of later in the season after the bye, people were on the Bears, and they lost. They went down a little bit, went down even further, and that's the moment when they destroyed the Texans. And the reason they kept going down is because obviously expectations were not being met. But that's why these kind of numbers are important, is anticipating what the market's not anticipating. Because the market, basically, to give you context, was reacting to the Bears losing, 4 games in a row? And the last game they lost was to a ravaged Lions team. I think Stafford was even hobbled in that game. And Stafford had 2 amazing drives late in the game on the road, and basically did to the Bears what the Bears did to the Lions week 1. And so everyone wrote off the Bears. And as you can see, it was the 3rd lowest conviction game of this, or 4th of the season. And they destroyed the Texans 41-7 or something, right? And that was a game.
And you can see that massive outperformance versus the spread, that super high dot that we can see there.
Exactly.
Approaching 30. So they basically covered by 30 points.
Yeah, and not to self-tout, but, that was a game I predicted the Bears would demolish the Texans. So I had a nice comp from the previous year of Texans versus Ravens in a very similar spot. But the reason I had that kind of conviction in that scenario was because the market was so oversold on the Bears that they neglected that the Bears actually played very well versus the Lions, except for basically the final quarter. And Matthew Stafford was just better than them. But the market doesn't really look at the game that way. It just sees the final score, the number, the final play, that was it. Well, no, the Bears were finding a rhythm. They were getting out of the hole that they were in. And that literally transitioned into the next game, and they destroyed Houston, won 3 in a row, and made the playoffs. So, but if you're not paying attention to the nuance of the game, which is what we do, we rewatch all of these games every week and, quickly in 20, 30 minutes to really just see how the game unfolds. That's where kind of fundamentally we kind of gather these insights. But then obviously here we have a chart demonstrating these actual technicals as well. So.
And you talk about the way you framed that issue is really sharp, because what it is talking about is balancing a fundamental perspective on the team with complemented by those market-oriented observations. You used a great word, which is oversold. Right? So you saw the fundamental kind of leanings that could suggest that maybe, so the team isn't as bad as the market suspects. And we can see when looking at market data that the market has abandoned the Bears. So that can create value when you have a team that's oversold like that. When we're even looking at this chart, basically anytime the market was oversold on the Bears, so basically abandoned them. So say 10% or lower, say they received 10% or lower broader from market support. We can see it only happened a few times, 3 and 1. So again, no angle, no pattern, no trend's gonna give you 100% hits. But if you can have a certain pattern that suggests, that's 3-1, that is a good leading indicator to suggest whether or not you want to support, a specific team. So this is, again, just the type of stuff, that we're also just really, this is the type of kind of like anecdotal observations that we've always kind of tracked from a season to season basis. But by this year is something that we're starting to really memorialize and quantify and visualize in this type of form, and that we're going to be bringing this and sharing it with all of you this year. And so we hope that, you'll be able to benefit with us over the course of the season. And again, bringing these sort of unique kind of angles and data insights that, again, most people aren't taking into consideration in their handicaps. And that is the definition of edge.
Yeah. And that's something I want to do an entire episode on is why the standard media market that everyone knows, how come they actually struggle so mightily actually handicapping and predicting game outcomes. And, it's just, they're not very good. They're good at giving general information about general things, but as far as like the final application of, well, this is how this scenario is going to play out this time or this game or this season, they just seem to look at probability as, well, this is most probable out of 1,000 times, so I'm just going to go with what probability says. Well, probability said the Chiefs were going to win the Super Bowl. Did that happen? Was it even close? Absolutely not. So how do you predict the probability that is low when it's going to hit? It's all about market timing, and that to me is kind of like this season's mantra for us, is looking at the entire NFL slate and all betting through a market timing lens always. Is it time for this event to go this way or that way? And most of them don't look at it that way. They just look at the numbers, look at the probability, and say, well, there's a 54% chance that the Bears are going to lose to Houston Texans. Okay, sure, if we play the game 1,000 times, but we're in this universe, in this reality, and how do we find edge into what is the real probability of this game today? It's not 46% Bears win. It's a different algorithm. So let's
move on. Let's take a look at the 2020 stats.
Here we go.
On the Bears, and kind of just get a broad kind of overview of how Bears performed in 2020.
One thing really sticks out with this if we look back at last year, and I think it speaks to Matt Nagy as a head coach, and I get more and more bearish on him each and every year. And what it is third down conversion percentage. Obviously 32nd is the worst in the NFL. But beyond that, rush percentage. So you have and I understand they had some running back injuries, but David Montgomery is like a very underrated talent, and it seems to actually be getting better every season. I know they lost Cohen early, but when you have a struggling quarterback like Trubisky especially, and McFoles, etc., how do you not find a way to, when you're already an average team with a decent defense, to play the game script in a manner which keeps you in position to win? Now, obviously they did. If we look back at the other chart, they were in position as an average team typically overall to win games or to be in games. But it makes me think that the Bears probably could have squeezed out another win or two if they actually just played to what their strength was, which was not passing the ball. So it's just kind of baffling to me that they're so low on this rush percentage, because that's a great way to salt away the game, keep the defense off of the field, basically just play to your strengths. And it makes me think Matt Nagy doesn't know what his strengths as a team are. He's trying to force the issue because he's trying to prove himself or something. I don't know. And that's a little concerning. It's basically a red flag. Like if you're in a relationship with someone, like, oh, that's a red flag. And I think that is a red flag for Matt Nagy, especially last season, because they struggled mightily throwing the ball. So yeah, that's my big takeaway on this. And then the defense, I think we're probably going to see a little, they're going to get more takeaways this season just because of, return to average. So, the defense could have a little bit of an uptick, though they've had some turnover. But yeah, any thoughts on this from last season, Brett?
Well, I think the Bears' kind of inconsistency on offense is also taken into the broader context of there was this kind of back and forth between who was calling plays for the Bears last year. So Nagy kind of opened the season calling the plays, and Bill Lazor kind of took over the latter half of the season. So a lot of noise in there, but I mean, it is interesting to see that, again, the Bears were generally an average team. Again, 8 wins, 8 covers, despite having definitely one of the worst offenses. And, again, like a better defense, as we can kind of see here. But yeah, we're not able to kind of generate turnovers, it's 26th. So if you can get some reversion to the mean there, Bears also struggled with a lot of injuries on the defensive side last year. Khalil Mack missed a couple games, and also even when he did play, really wasn't the vintage Khalil Mack that we're used to. So not sure if he's maybe over the hill or just couldn't ever get fully healthy last year. But if you can get a Khalil Mack, like a 2018, 2019 version of Khalil Mack in 2021, that'll be huge, especially relative to the other pieces that they have on defense this year. And then again, on offense, I'm cautiously optimistic on them. Maybe if we want to move on to the next slide, and we can talk about some of the key offseason moves that the Bears made, because I think one of the reasons why I'm cautiously optimistic on the offense is relative to market expectation, in the sense that people are acting like Andy Dalton is Nathan Peterman. That's true. He's like a totally washed up quarterback that provides no value whatsoever, and he's not a legitimate starting quarterback, mostly off of the perception of last year, where he actually had the best completion percentages he's ever had in his career last year. And that was behind a miserable offensive line that was totally beat up over the course of the season. Yeah, he had great weapons with the wide receiving core, and he is going to have a downgrade here with the Bears. But if the Bears offensive line can stay healthy, the Bears have a very average offensive line. It's not great, it's not terrible, it's average. And I mean, if they can outperform it all and just give Andy Dalton time, Andy Dalton is perfectly good enough to lead this team to the playoffs. I think Andy Dalton will perform better at quarterback than the market is pricing right now. And he's going to play better than Trubisky did last year, that Foles did last year.
That's a good point.
And everyone's kind of like so excited about Justin Fields, totally writing off Andy Dalton. And I won't get into the Justin Fields rant here, maybe at another time. But I mean, I'm bearish on Justin Fields. I think the Bears gave up way too much for him. And it's unfair to Andy Dalton, because again, I think if the broader context was more positive around him right now, because again, he's got Fields breathing over his shoulder right now. All the fans want Justin Fields. And Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy are also under the microscope, that if there's even a moment of adversity for Andy Dalton, it's like, I don't think he's going to get the benefit of the doubt, unfortunately. And so the Bears could nuke themselves this year, because I think if they bring in Justin Fields, this team's going to bomb. They're going to be terrible. And that's when you want to sell the Bears, is if they prematurely bring in Justin Fields.
Yeah, well, actually, I think that's going to lead us to our next slide anyways, which is the schedule. So I agree with your point. I think Andy Dalton gets kind of like he's awful. I mean, the dude started for like 8 seasons and had like 6 playoff runs. Like, I know, and that was with the Bengals. I mean, the Bengals are the most dysfunctional organization in football, and he managed to pull it off with them. So I think you're right. I think early in the season is when, if we broke the season down in quarters, which is something we're looking at this season to do more specifically, I think the first quarter is when you should buy the Bears. I mean, because that middle of the season stretch is probably, if Justin Fields plays this season, it's going to come at the tail end of that stretch when they play Green Bay, Tampa, San Francisco, Steelers, and then Ravens. So I think really the Bears' chance for this season to have a decent season is Andy Dalton to play decent early. Bears, can beat Bengals, can beat the Browns, can beat Lions, Raiders, maybe get 3-2, 4-1 before that brutal stretch, kind of finish at like 4-4, 5-4 type situation. Then they'll, I think at that point though, if they're at 500 by week 10, they're going to put Justin Fields in probably at the bye or after the Ravens game if they get beat. So even though I agree with you on the Andy Dalton front, I think it's inevitable that if the Bears are middling, which we have established from last year, they're pretty much a middling type team, that they're definitely going to put Justin Fields in at some point, and it's probably going to be by the Ravens game or after that game. Because if they go down the Andy Dalton path and they miss the playoffs, like Matt Nagy drafted him for what, right? Like they might as well put him in if you're going to, if the Titanic is sinking, you might as well, have a good meal before you eat the dust. So, or bite the dust. So yeah, that's kind of how I see it playing. So actually, your confidence in Andy Dalton actually gives me more kind of perspective that early in the season, if you want to bet the Bears, is really probably a great time to back them. And remember, Bears have had a history of starting seasons fairly decently. Last year they were 5-1. 5-1. Yeah. I think the year before that, or the year before that one, was it Matt Nagy's first year, and they lost to the Packers on a amazing Rodgers comeback. But the Bears were also started the season very hot. So I think Nagy gets his team buying in, has ideas of what he wants to do. I think his problem is, though, he's a little bit of a stickler for what he wants to do, which is where Andy Dalton probably fits in. Andy Dalton can actually maybe do more of what Nagy wants his quarterback to do, which will benefit the Bears offense. But once Justin Fields comes in, I think you're going to have tension there, and just kind of he's a young quarterback. He's got skill sets he wants to use. So that situation may not work as well as maybe Chicago fans hope. So yeah, that's kind of my Bears outlook on the season, I think, at the moment.
Well, one thing I did want to touch upon too was the addition of Tom Herman as the Bears, one of the Bears' offensive analysts. And maybe that name doesn't ring a bell to some, but Tom Herman was one of the most sought after college coaches just 3-4 years ago, coming from Houston. Texas signed him for $50 million. He was supposed to be, kind of the next generation of offensive geniuses. And, a lot of pressure at Texas. In fact, his Texas offenses were explosive, regularly scoring 40, 50 points a game. The thing is, the defense was always just so miserable. No matter how many points they scored, they still ended up losing a lot of those marquee games that Texas alumni and that, a broader kind of larger kind of sports program like Texas just doesn't have the patience for. So he did eventually get fired. But, and after that Texas job, now all of a sudden, the Bears kind of sneak in here without really generating much headlines, hire Tom Herman as an offensive analyst. And if his fingerprints can really be on this offense, if the Bears offense outperforms markedly market expectations, I think it's a key variable affecting that outcome is going to be Tom Herman. And I don't hear a lot of people talking about this at all, and I think it's critical. And that's why, on our previous slide, we, kind of talked about the top 3 additions there, and I don't see anybody talking about one of the top 3 additions that the Bears have made is Tom Herman, and I would definitely put that in that top 3. But when we're looking at the 2021, look ahead, Vegas has the Bears estimated at 7 wins over under. My concern here is, as we talked about early on in the video, the Bears' strength of schedule last year was 29th, and they had an average outcome. The estimated strength of schedule this year is 9th, so much more difficult. And we can see that on the chart too, just anecdotally, playing, the Rams, the Browns, Packers twice, Raiders, they got a tough offense. Bucks, Niners are going to be much better than last year. Pittsburgh's probably still going to be tough. Obviously the Ravens. So, and then the Seahawks. This is a brutal schedule. And then also the Vikings twice, which, when we preview the Vikings, we'll talk a little bit more about how we are both kind of jointly much more bullish on them this year than we were last year. So it's going to be a really tough schedule. But of course, that assumes every team is healthy. You don't know how all these teams are ultimately going to play out. But if the Bears defense can, again, have one of those seasons where they play really well, and the Bears offense is stable, the offensive line plays at minimum average and just can stay healthy, I think that sets the Bears up to possibly surprise. And in that scenario, I could lean over the 7 wins here, because one of the things we also have to remember, there's 18 games this year. So, this is not even like going 7-9. This is just 7-10.
And
so can the Bears go 7-10?
I think it's 17. So it's 18 weeks.
Well, there's
18
weeks, 17 games. So, normally 7-9. So do you think the Bears can go 7-10?
Yeah.
7-10 gives you a push. And in the upside variability of that, I think the Bears can go 10-7. Now the downside is probably equidistant. So 4-13. Ugh, man, that's tough. But the 4-13 outcome is based on Andy Dalton getting hurt and Justin Fields coming in prematurely, or just Justin Fields coming in prematurely at any point in time. Again, just because the broader front office, the fan base, everyone is kind of just like Andy Dalton is like just a distraction. Like, when can we hurry up and get him out of here and just see Justin Fields?
And even though I feel like I've seen this movie so many times, including Washington's Jay Gruden. It's kind of what this season feels like. If I had to pick a scenario, I'm not bullish on the Bears this season. I think it's going to play out almost exactly like Jay Gruden's Washington season, because they do play the Rams and the Browns and the Raiders before that tough stretch. The Bears very well could be sitting at 2-3 and then lose 4 in a row. Nagy gets fired in the middle of the season potentially. Justin Fields comes in. Herman becomes interim head coach. I don't know if that's going to happen. Probably the defense coordinator. He's really sharp, by the way. Apparently he's a long-standing, super brilliant guy who teaches colleges about statistics and stuff while he works in the NFL. So I just think it's more likely to be the Jay Gruden Haskins show. Though I think Justin Fields is definitely better than the Haskins. Rather than this kind of Andy Dalton resurgence and the Bears are 4-1 and they beat the Packers and they're going to the playoffs with 12 wins. Who knew? I almost put that at very little chance of happening. And a lot of it's due because of the schedule. It's just they don't have the team to really perform amazing throughout the season. So
it's the schedule. The schedule is super tough. And I don't want to frame my view of Andy Dalton as an Andy Dalton resurgence.
Okay.
Because again, I'm talking about market expectations of Andy Dalton is as if he is totally worthless. I think he's better than worthless and is sufficient enough to lead the team to more victories than the market expects. If, again, a lot of ifs, if the offensive line can stay healthy, if the offensive line can at least lean in the direction of outperformance, and just the Bears can just more broadly stay healthy. They have good weapons. I mean, obviously, Allen Robinson, one of the best wide receivers in the league. Tariq Cohen is going to be back, going to be interesting to see how he kind of rebounds from his injury last year. Darnell Mooney had an awesome first year in the league last year. Cole Kmet has shown signs, still have Jimmy Graham. He can at least be like a nice, like 1-2 punch at tight end. Not that I'm like, Jimmy Graham's like a huge impact, but he does play well in the end zone. I mean, in the red zone. Sure. He can still be a weapon there. And it's just all about decision making too. Like Trubisky and Foles can make bad decisions, especially when under pressure. And again, I just feel like Andy Dalton is a higher IQ quarterback than both of them.
Yeah.
But again, the schedule, yes, is super tough. And I think that's going to be the number one inhibitor of the Bears possibly not reaching over 7 wins, in conjunction with, again, Justin Fields coming in prematurely. But which way do you lean on the Vegas, on the estimated wins here, 7? If you had to make a bet again, because I want to at least, kind of memorialize how we're feeling this early in the stage. I mean, it's June right now, so it's still super early. Got to go through all training camp. So these are still very preliminary views. We're not making any futures bets right now. So these are definitely leans.
Though,
but right now I'm gonna lean over.
Though I will say I've already put future bets on the Chiefs and the Bucks, but just FYI.
Well, I think you did that like after the Super Bowl.
Actually, I did it before the Super Bowl. I honestly, this is the first time I've ever called a rematch in the Super Bowl, just because obviously injuries change everything, but I think the prices are just going to get tighter and tighter if they're healthy down the stretch. But yeah, I mean, I got to go with my gut. I mean, if Rodgers is going to be back with the Packers, that's probably 2 losses. He owns the Bears. If the Vikings are better this year than like how we're predicting, I mean, that could be 2 losses potentially. I mean, if they get 4 losses between those 2 games, it's not going to hit 7, probably 5 or 6, especially with, switching quarterbacks and all that jargon. So I would lean under. I think it's entirely dependent on the first 5 weeks. However those first 5 weeks go is how the season's going to go.
And speaking to that point, actually, it would be great that if the Bears are maybe hotter than expected those first couple of weeks, is probably a good time to start to shift the broader macro view and then start to fade the market expectations, kind of over elevated market expectations at that time, because they're so myopic, that they're not looking to seeing how the path has changed from where you came.
And honestly, the beautiful thing about prediction, handicapping, sports betting is I can say, I think the Bears aren't going to win 7 games, tough schedule, they're not very good. I think, and we've talked about this off the pod, off the stream, we think they're going to cover versus the Rams week 1 as of right now. And the more I think about the matchup and the situation, I'm kind of the thought, if they're going to cover, they're probably going to win. And that's just it's probably going to be close in the end or whatever. But if it's in position to cover, I think the Bears probably could win week 1 and then like stub their toe versus the Bengals, right? Like, though I think they would beat the Bengals. So and that's where they're going to have to pick up these types of wins. Like, if they want to make the playoffs, they got to beat a Rams team. They got to beat the Raiders. Like, they got to beat Seahawks late in the season. Like, they got to pick up some wins like that. So week 1's as good of any time, because remember, I mean, Bears have a new quarterback, but so do the Rams, and Stafford has to get acclimated in a new system, which he's been in the same organization for a long time. And Bears, like, to your point, Brett, that you've mentioned a lot, is Bears know Matthew Stafford, to whatever that means. They can't necessarily stop him all the time, but they're not going to be afraid of him. It's not an unknown. Unknowns are always scarier than knowns, even if the known is Patrick Mahomes. The Bucs knew Patrick Mahomes going into the Super Bowl. He's scary, but we know what he does, So at least we know how we should stop them, whether we can or not. So. But anything else we want to leave the fine people of Sportfolio Kings with?
No, I think that's it. Again, we're going to be doing these preseason previews for all 32 teams over the course of the summer. So today was the Chicago Bears. We'll lean into the rest of the NFC North over the coming days. So I think that wraps up today's episode. So let's rip the face off the market, Kings.
And of course, King me, always.